In 1975, a group of researchers asked scuba divers to do something strange. They had them memorize a list of words, some while underwater, some on dry land. Then they tested their recall in both environments. What they discovered accidentally revealed something about human learning that most people still don't understand. Something that explains why language immersion programs can accomplish in 3 weeks what classrooms can't do in 3 years. Why some people come back from trips fundamentally transformed, while others just come back with photos. And it has almost nothing to do with how hard you practice. Your brain processes information differently when you're learning in an unfamiliar environment. Not slightly differently, fundamentally differently. The mechanisms behind this are well documented in neuroscience, but the implications? Almost nobody is using them. Once you understand what's actually happening in your head when you learn something new in a new place, you'll never approach skill building the same way again. Let's start with what happens the moment you land somewhere unfamiliar. Your brain has this system called the locus coeruleus. It's essentially your neurological alarm clock. It releases norepinephrine whenever something unexpected happens. And in a new environment, everything is unexpected. The sounds, the smells, the way people move through space. Here's what most people don't realize. That same chemical that makes you feel alert and slightly on edge, it's also a learning accelerator. Norepinephrine enhances something called synaptic plasticity, your brain's ability to form new connections. Studies show that information encountered during states of heightened arousal gets encoded more deeply and retrieved more easily. So that slightly overwhelmed feeling you get on day 1 of a trip, that's not a bug. That's your brain priming itself to absorb information at an accelerated rate. Now layer a new skill on top of that state, and something interesting happens. When you're learning to cook mole in Oaxaca, your brain isn't just encoding the recipe. It's encoding the smell of the market where you bought the chiles, the sound of your instructor's voice, the texture of grinding spices by hand, the taste of mezcal you had after. Compare that to learning the same recipe in your kitchen at home, where everything else is familiar and your brain is basically running on autopilot. The novelty of place amplifies the novelty of skill. Your brain treats the entire experience as important. But here's where it gets counterintuitive. You'd think that learning something in a specific place would lock that knowledge to that place. That you'd only remember how to cook mole when you're back in Oaxaca. The opposite is true. And it has to do with those scuba divers. Remember that underwater experiment? The results were striking. Divers who learned underwater remembered significantly better when tested underwater. And those who learned on land performed better on land. Your brain doesn't just store information. It stores information bundled with the context where you learned it. Now, you might think this argues against learning abroad. If you learn salsa in Mexico City, won't you only remember it in Mexico City? Actually, the opposite happens. And this is the part that changed how I think about skill acquisition. When you learn in a rich, multi-sensory, emotionally significant environment, you create what researchers call elaborate encoding. You're not storing one memory, you're storing dozens of interconnected memories. The movement, the music, the crowded dance floor, the moment you finally got the turn right. When you return home and hear similar music, your brain has multiple pathways to retrieve what you learned. The skill isn't locked to one context. It's woven into a web of associated memories. That's why people come back from immersive experiences and say the skill stuck in a way their regular lessons never did. So we've got novelty supercharging your brain's ability to encode. We've got rich environments creating webs of memory that follow you home. But there's a third mechanism. And honestly, this one surprised me the most. It has to do with difficulty, but not in the way you'd expect. Here's something that seems like it shouldn't be true. Adding more difficulty to learning, not less, often produces better results. Motor learning researchers talk about something called the challenge point framework. The idea is simple. Learning is optimized when the difficulty of a task matches your current ability, but with a slight stretch. Too easy, and your brain doesn't engage. Too hard, and you shut down. Here's what's interesting about learning abroad. The environment itself provides natural challenge layering. When you're taking surf lessons in Costa Rica, you're not just learning to pop up on a board. You're navigating a new place, communicating with instructors who might speak a different first language, reading unfamiliar wave patterns, managing the disorientation of being far from home. This sounds like it would be overwhelming, but research suggests the opposite. When challenges are varied rather than singular, learners often perform better. Why? Because your brain can't fall back on the same tired neural pathways. It's forced to stay present, to problem solve in real time, to actually pay attention. Think about the last time you tried to learn something in a completely comfortable environment. Maybe a YouTube tutorial while sitting on your couch. How much of that do you actually remember? Now compare that to a time you learned something while slightly outside your comfort zone. When the stakes felt real. When you couldn't just tab over to Instagram when it got hard. That discomfort isn't fighting your learning. It's fueling it. But here's the thing. Everything I've described so far, the novelty, the memory encoding, the productive challenge, that's all about how your brain acquires information. There's something even more powerful happening when you learn abroad, and it has nothing to do with cognition. It has to do with who you believe you are. At home, you have a fixed sense of who you are. You're the person who's not athletic, who has 2 left feet, who can't cook. These identities have been reinforced by years of evidence and social feedback. When you travel, that identity loosens. Psychologists call this identity flexibility, the phenomenon where people in unfamiliar environments become more open to trying new behaviors, because the social constraints that usually hold them in place temporarily disappear. Nobody in that salsa class in Mexico City knows you as the person who doesn't dance. Your coworkers aren't watching. Your family isn't there to remind you of that time you embarrassed yourself at your cousin's wedding. You get to try on a new version of yourself. And here's the thing, that version often sticks. Studies on travel and personality change suggest that people who learn new skills abroad don't just acquire abilities. They often shift how they see themselves. They come back identifying as someone who surfs or someone who speaks Spanish, rather than someone who took a few lessons. That identity shift is worth more than the skill itself, because identity drives behavior long after the trip ends. So now we have 4 mechanisms working together. Novelty priming your brain, rich context creating sticky memories, productive challenge forcing engagement, and identity flexibility letting you become someone new. But there's one more piece, and it might be the most practical of all. It explains why 1 week of immersion can outpace months of weekly lessons, even when the total hours are the same. Let's do some math that doesn't make sense. Take a 1-hour salsa lesson once a week for 6 months. That's roughly 24 hours of instruction. Now, take a week-long immersion in Mexico City. Maybe 20 hours of actual lessons. By raw hours, they're almost identical. But the outcomes aren't even close. Why? When you learn through weekly lessons at home, you're fighting against your environment. You're carving out 1 hour a week where you're supposed to be a dancer, and then returning to 167 hours where you're not. Every week, you start slightly rusty. You spend the first 15 minutes remembering what you learned last time. Your brain has to context switch from normal life mode to learning mode. By the time you're warmed up, the lesson's almost over. When you learn through immersion, the ratio flips. You wake up thinking about the skill. You practice it. You eat lunch discussing it. You watch others do it. You dream about it. You're surrounded by people who care about it. A week of immersion isn't 7 one-hour lessons. It's a complete environment where every stimulus reinforces what you're learning. Your brain doesn't have to work to stay engaged. The engagement is the default. This is why language immersion programs work better than years of classroom study. Why culinary students who train in France outpace those who stay home. Why a week at surf camp can compress what would take months of occasional beach trips. The math of learning isn't linear. Environment is a multiplier. So let's put it all together. Novelty primes your brain for accelerated encoding. Rich, multi-sensory environments create webs of memory that follow you home. Productive challenge forces your brain to stay engaged. Identity flexibility lets you try on new versions of yourself. And immersion creates a learning environment that weekly lessons can't replicate. 5 mechanisms, all working together, all activated by the same thing: learning a skill in a foreign place. This is exactly why we built Nomara around skill-based travel. Not resort vacations where you return with photos but nothing changed. Not adventure tourism where you check boxes but don't grow. We design experiences where you're learning something meaningful. Salsa in Mexico City, surfing in Costa Rica, skiing in the French Alps. An environment specifically chosen to amplify how your brain acquires that skill. Small groups of growth-oriented travelers. Instructors who understand immersive learning. Itineraries built around the psychology of transformation. Because the science is clear, where you learn matters as much as what you learn. If this changed how you think about learning, subscribe. We're building a channel around the psychology of transformative travel, why it works, how to design it, and what the research actually says. Check the link in the description if you want to see what Nomara trips look like. And drop a comment. What skill would you want to learn in a foreign place if time and money weren't obstacles? I'll see you in the next one.